about this morning is right-siding governance for an AI-driven world. So what we'll try to do with a pretty excellent panel, as I'm sure you'd agree, is talk a bit about shared compute and data initiatives that hopefully give all nations access to AI resources. We'll look a bit at how to up-level the playing field for smaller and developing nations. And we'll talk about collaboration in key sectors like healthcare and education and climate resilience. I've got a perfect panel to do that with. I'm going to introduce them all first, and then we'll dive straight into the conversation. So unfortunately, Navrina Singh from Credo AI couldn't be with us this morning. She's got a meeting with the president, so she's excused. But we do have, I'll start with just next to me here, Isabella Wilkinson, who's a research fellow on the Digital Society program with the Chatham House. Next to her is Rafik Rikorian. I hope I've pronounced that vaguely okay, who is the Chief Technology Officer for Mozilla. Next to him, I've got Rajesh Nambia, who is the president of NASSCOM, our sister association here in India. And last but not least, we've got Halak Shirastava, managed, who's Global AI and Public Policy and Regulatory Affairs at Cohere. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Sabina Chofu. I'm International Policy and Strategy Lead at Tech UK. So we are the sister association of NASSCOM, but back in the UK. So without further ado, we will start with setting a bit of a global context, and who better to do that than Isabella. So from a kind of geopolitical perspective, how realistic, I guess, is alignment on AI governance across countries with, fair to say, very different strategic interests right now? And where do you see maybe, multilateral institutions? I know multilateralism is not a very popular theme these days, but where do you see multilateral institutions or maybe other international players playing a role in this space? So over to you.
Thank you, Sabina. Thanks to my fellow speakers. It's great to be here today, really keeping the energy up on the final day of the summit. We can all do it. Let me answer your question directly and then perhaps elaborate a little bit more in detail. Global consensus on how to govern AI is a no-go. It is not going to happen in this geopolitical environment. However, partial alignment on priority issue areas is possible, and it's pragmatic to throw our weight behind these smaller gatherings that we can then scale using the multilateral format. Now let's take a second to sketch out the state of play, and I know that we have some great experts in the room on the panel, so I won't spend too long doing this. We have been absolutely covered in really optimistic summit rhetoric, walking into Bharat Mandapam, going to side events over the course of this week. But despite the optimism, outside of these walls in the background, the US-China AI race continues to accelerate to the umpteenth degree. The capabilities of advanced and the most frontier AI systems and models, the little we know about their capabilities, mined with huge gaps in transparency, continue to advance. And global scientists only recently have issued warnings about the state of the science and the intense uncertainty surrounding these capabilities and the impact they might be having on our communities and societies. Well, it's a good thing we have strong international institutions and shared values. We don't. It's a really difficult time for global cooperation outside of AI. We're seeing, I would argue, since the Second World War, an unprecedented degradation of the international organizations, the shared values, the rule of law that we have all held so dearly. So, suffice to say, it's a difficult time for global governance. It's a difficult time for the global governance of AI. Now, institutions in the past have very much been brokers, mediators, and scalers of consensus on tricky governance issues. And some of the governance problems we're facing today are pretty old, right? I mean, I've encountered them in previous roles at Chatham House and other areas of tech. I'm sure the experts on our panel have come across them. And the core governance puzzle that we need to figure out is this. taking into account the state of geopolitics, the uncertainty around the state of the science, the market dynamics mediated by these leading labs and, intensely competitive US and Chinese AI race dynamics, how on earth do we bring rivals and competitors around the same table? How do we bring states with a nominal or a minimal alignment of interests and incentives into the same room? Now, you started by asking me about multilateralism and institutions, but maybe let's reframe this and talk about coalitions. In other areas of governance, what we've seen is intense coalition building in crisis or unstable settings around a trusted mechanism, a trusted approach, perhaps in the absence of shared values and principles. And what I'm really interested in the context of AI, is where coalition building can develop trust around a credible governance approach, adopt a state champion, get support from associations, from builders, from leading labs themselves, and then scale it using the multilateral format. And over the past few days, I've been really excited by some of this splintering to scale dynamics that I've seen maybe in conversations on verification, on-chip hardware, risk mitigation strategies, even anonymized collection of usage data, which came out of the commitments yesterday. Now, what's the messaging that can drive this coalition building in the absence of trusted institutions, in the absence of shared values? I'll get into this later in my remarks, but I think it has to be sovereignty and strategic autonomy. Resource-constrained countries who might decide to adopt a common data governance approach, who might decide to pool resources like compute, have to also consider a degree of governance alignment, again, at this low-hanging fruit, in order to not only withstand the dynamics of the AI race, but to ensure that the collective benefits of cooperation and governance alignment massively outweigh anything they could do individually. So I think I'll leave it there. Slightly pessimistic take. Let's see if there's some more optimism on the rest of the panel.
Thank you so much, Bella. I don't think it was that pessimistic. You did kind of. I think you made it sound very pragmatic in terms of, look, the world is not what we want it to be, and there isn't the level of multilateral cooperation that we maybe used to have. But you have talked about coalition building, and it's probably the best we can hope for in the world as it is, as opposed to the world as we'd like it right now. And Rajesh, can I turn to you next? For emerging economy, obviously access to compute, data, and infrastructure are critical. But what do you see of some of the barriers most pressing, but also maybe opportunities for AI adoption in India and beyond? So over to you.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me in the panel. Pleased to be with all of you, and then there's a few of you who showed up here as well. So thank you for coming up. We wish this was the Modi inauguration last evening, where we had a little bit more than this crowd, but nevertheless we'll do with this. But I believe we used to talk about digital divide for a long period of time, and I think while that had its own puts and takes, when you compare a smaller economy and smaller country with a larger one and so on, I think the AI divide is going to be much, much bigger than the digital divide which we saw, because the biggest difference is that at least that in the digital divide, it's about access and so on, whereas this is all about agency, and then it can completely put you at a different back foot. So it is such an important topic to talk about when you talk about the broader haves and have-nots, and what really goes on with the larger smaller economies and so on. And I truly believe that the accessibility, when you look at the broader scales, it will come across multiple things, starting with compute, one of the largest piece of what we are talking about here, right? I think as I think Isabella, you mentioned in terms of the race between the US and China and so on and so forth. But if you leave those two countries, then of course we have a big drop in terms of where the real access is going to be. And I believe totally that the continued limited access to the broader compute facility is going to be unduly putting some of these smaller countries, especially the developing ones, into a little bit of a disadvantage. So I think there's a lot that can be done around it in terms of saying, what is that countries can potentially do in terms of pooling and so on. But I think there is certainly an issue when it comes to compute. and and not just in terms of accessibility, but also in terms of expense and so on. Because at the end of the day, all of these are even if you use the purchasing power parity and sort of look at what it costs for people to sort of get into the kind of level of GPUs potentially or GPU clusters one has to produce to even have a meaningful language model and so on. I think that's going to be a very different ball game. And the second element of this whole broader issue that we're talking about is also the data, and then the organization of data, availability of data, quality of data, and so on. I think the more you get into the developed world, you will find, or developing world, you will find that the data itself is very siloed in many ways. There are different state silos, different department silos, and so on, and it gets into a point where the data, which is such an important and integral part of everything to do with AI, you will end up having the data which gets fed into the broader models and eventually the AI systems will necessarily not have the right representation of that population, which is a huge concern. I mean especially when you, of course, India is slightly luckier in many ways in terms of us, playing that game a little bit, punching a little bit above our weight in some sense. But when you go down on the list of countries which do not have access to all of these, I think you're going to find it even harder in terms of solving the data issue and the data availability, data quality. All of this becomes a bigger issue. And there, when we talked about infrastructure gap, compute gap, it's a little bit more than just the pure compute itself, GPUs and so on. But it's also about connectivity, power. These are the issues which we somehow take it for granted in other segments. But I think you will find that power is going to be a huge foundation for all of that. And as you know, that there are multiple layers in building any of the AI systems, and one of the bottommost layer is going to be power. And then what really happens to the power, and if it has to be clean power, then does it put additional tax on the developing world for making sure that power comes out clean. Connectivity is a huge issue, even though it's kind of broadly solved in some sense with all the satellite options and so on. But we continue to have the kind of connectivity you need to run a truly inclusive AI system is going to be very different from those people have thought otherwise. And then of course we can go on and on in terms of the other layers of skills will become a huge issue. The availability of skills and ensuring that you have the right skills, not just to leverage AI but also to build AI. I mean, there are two different type of capabilities that you need to produce in any country. So these are the issues, and how do you make sure that you have a broader the opportunity itself would be to sort of look at this and say, are there other ways of collaborating, other ways of partnering and so on? Because these, especially when you go down the line list of countries, we have close to 200 countries or so in the world, and when you leave the top 5 or 10 and then you go below, and then you keep going down the list, it becomes harder. I mean, I don't think that everybody is going to be producing a full-blown large language model and things that they need to sort of do it for themselves. And at that point in time, the question will be, can you really partner? Can you really leverage some of the common systems that can be done across these countries and so on?
Thank you. I mean, you've done a brilliant job at putting all the free problems we've got, and then saying you've got a long list afterwards in terms of cooperation. But I love the touch of optimism there at the end. It's like, if you leave 2 countries out of the room, you still have 100 and whatever 85 that need to figure it out. So I liked a lot that framing, and thanks for touching on the infrastructure. I think we tend to talk a lot about data and semiconductors and all the cool stuff, and we forget about like the tissue that actually holds it all together. So really, really great contribution. And talking about data access and access to compute, I'm going to turn to Rafi, because and I'm hoping you're coming in with the hope after the doom and gloom of not multilateral cooperation. So from a technical and open ecosystem perspective, how does access to compute and the high quality data that Rajesh was talking about shape who gets to build AI? And what design choices or collaborative models could help lower barriers, obviously without compromising trust and security that makes the technology work to start with. So over to you, Rafi.
I mean, unsurprisingly, being someone from Mozilla, I'll probably go with the open source angle as one of the opportunities to actually align the talent, align the capabilities, and actually do shared infrastructure. I mean, maybe I'll draw two analogies to think about, and then we can go more deep into those as it applies to AI. But for all practical purposes, every computer on the planet runs Linux. There are a few iPhones here and there on top of it, but the Linux model, I think, is a good one for all of us to think about. That like every country, every nation in the world, almost every company in the world contributes to this single code base, which is then deployed across these billions of computing devices across the planet, and then lots of derivative work that happens from it. So like a company like Google can then take that and make it into Android. A company like a vending machine company can deploy Linux onto their Raspberry Pi and run inside their vending machine. So I think there's an analogy here of being able to use shared infrastructure, shared software infrastructure as a collaboration mechanism that we can all pool resources together but still have sovereignty on top of it. So we can still all be contributing to this common core, but then fine-tune our way to our own particular implementations. And I think that if we take that and then marry it with a web analogy of, in the early 90s of the original web, you needed to ask for permission in order to deploy a website. And by permission, I mean effectively you had to go buy yourself a Solaris box, you had to buy yourself a Windows NT server, you were trying to configure an ActiveX scenario. And what the beauty of what Mozilla and Firefox did, we're not the only ones who did it, but the beauty of what they did there is they forced openness throughout the stack that enabled anyone without permission to build whatever they wanted. And I think we need to find a similar moment. So like in that world, we went from the Windows NT stack and all of IIS to the LAMP stack. And the LAMP stack has this gorgeous analogies of just like anyone can build on Linux. When Facebook needed PHP to move faster, they did massive improvements on PHP, which then trickle down to all of us. So people can contribute in different ways across it. That's not the world we're currently living on in AI. We're living in this world where there are a few frontier model companies that are effectively doing governance for all of us in some way, shape, or form. And I agree with my colleague that that's an untenable situation. Like I do live in San Francisco, but you don't want 4 people in San Francisco making governance decisions for the entire world. That doesn't make a lot of sense. So I do think if we can find the LAMP stack equivalent model for AI, and this is actually what I've turned all of Mozilla towards, of just like how do we define open standards, how do we define open interfaces so that the vibrancy of the open source community can come together and actually build solutions that work for every single person, every single community, every single government on the planet. You can sort of build upon, you can contribute to the common base, but then build upon it and take it in a way that makes it more aligned with your country's values or your company's values or your individual values, and you can fine-tune your solution out of that. So I think there is an analogy here around how open source could actually provide digital sovereignty across all the different levels, give us agency as a person, give opportunities for flexibility at the corporation level, and then give countries the ability to own their version of the stack. That could actually be quite beautiful if we can actually figure out how to do that in an appropriate way. So I tried to give you a dose of optimism.
You have given me a dose of optimism, but I'm absolutely shocked you talked about open source. Thanks so much, Rafi. And I did appreciate you brought up the standards, because I'm going to talk to Halak, and we're going to go a bit into collaboration and standards here. So obviously with the myriad of AI governance frameworks, I'm going to turn to you on the question of where do you see potential for alignment on standards, maybe in some interoperability, some maybe risk management framework? So, keep us on the hopeful path, please.
I am here to provide the hopeful perspective. Let me start out by saying that I lead global public policy at Cohere. Cohere is a Canadian AI developer. We build models, and we have agentic AI. Our solution is called North. In my role, I look across the global regulatory framework. That means if our startup wants to, do business in a certain country, I try to understand the regulatory landscape of that country, and then I advise our company if it's favorable or not. when we're talking about governance and frameworks that are existing, my perspective is I think it's not there yet, but I have a more promising view of it. I think that in certain principles, we are converging to where we need to go, and there are strong opportunities. Technical standards is one of them. You know, there are frameworks like NIST and ISO frameworks. For startups, these are key. The reason they're key is because they're flexible and they're evolving. If we just go country by country, what that's going to do is price out smaller companies. But if we have an international framework that is evolving and flexible, and also including industry coalition, which a lot of the model developers are a part of, but also like other stakeholders can be a part of as well, I think it really helps. The second thing I would say is around shared practices around risk mitigation. So I think there's strong opportunity there as we come together and share documents or evaluations around misuse or model capabilities or impact of models. I think, like I said, we have a way to go, but we are moving closer to that. And then the third thing I would say is interoperability of shared resources. This is key. We have a big ecosystem. So yes, there is big tech involved, but there are smaller players. And every single day, there's new startups that are wanting to emerge and wanting to have a go-to-market strategy. And the only way this is possible is if industry and all of industry, big and small, the whole ecosystem starts sharing documentation around, red teaming or evals or multilingual benchmarks and things like that to come to some sort of consensus.
Thanks so much. I'm really enjoying this positive vibe we're going with, and that combination. I think it kind of links really nicely back to what Bella was saying. Around coalitions, build on themes, right?
Yes.
It's like where do we think we have common ground and what we think we can build on. So I really enjoyed that contribution. Rajesh, can I turn to you next? Because I did wonder what all this stuff means for, in kind of smaller and developing economies. And maybe if you have any examples of shared standards, pooled resources, any of the stuff that Halak was talking about, public-private models, or anything that you've seen that looks promising, that looks like it could deliver.
As we said, when the moment you look at shared models, there are multiple reasons why we want to do this, and one, of course, as we've talked about, the cost involved in sort of doing some of that. I think that itself is becoming cost prohibitive, and hence there may not be even an option for many of the countries, but to sort of have this shared model. We also find that in the regional compute consortiums that folks can potentially create, and you often see examples of where, for example, a standard data set and stuff like that being shared by, not just by, even within a country, it could be between government, academia, and then industry, sort of sharing the same set of data sets, so making sure that they're able to leverage that in some sense. Compute is clearly something which continues to be be shared resources in many of the, even in India, for example, our own AI mission has created this cluster where it can be broadly leveraged by both the industry, academia, and the government in terms of ensuring that they're able to get access to the right set of GPU, GPU farms, and ensuring that they're able to use that and take it forward. So public-private sharing of data, certainly the compute consortium, and then cloud credits. I think that's something which sovereigns have been able to work with the hyperscalers, especially in terms of getting a lot of cloud credits for the GPUs, especially, right? Because which is needed for even if it's not about building a frontier model, but it's even to leverage the frontier model, build some reasoning models on top of it, and ensuring that you're able to build an application which is meaningful. Not that every time you need a powerful GPU, but there are occasions where you definitely would need, and hence using some of those cloud credits will become a big need. And then, of course, when you switch to regulations and so on, and ensuring that, how do you make sure that even having a policy, it's something which is shared across. You don't want to reinvent the wheel every single time. So, do you have a method by which you could leverage the existing, look at what is out there in the world, and then sort of leverage it, and then try to reuse it? Because what you don't want is to have this 100 versions of the same thing with a few nuances here and there. So that's something which I think companies will try and create a model as well.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to kind of turn over to...
Key question on the title. Can I be allowed title of the
Yes.
session? So it says right-sizing governance in an AI-driven world.
Yes.
I thought we were looking forward to a truth, transparency, and accountability-driven world.
Yeah.
It takes 30 years for Epstein files to come out in a place like America,
Right.
in the developed world. Is
Sure.
that the speed of the system till it collapses and till we start a renewal? Are we resigned to that fate?
Yeah. So I can't really see the link between the Epstein files and this.
30 years since
Yes,
the first
yes,
disclosure by
sure.
Karen Mulder
Sure.
in
Got it.
2001.
Yeah.
To the truth to come out. So
I
if
got
that's
it.
the system speed,
Yes.
it's terrible.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So on just to kind of build on what Rajesh was saying there on kind of also the capability. So maybe if we move into a bit of like cross-border cooperation, and Bella, if I can maybe turn to you just to build on those points, because obviously what we are seeing kind of across the developing world in particular, often it's kind of the institutional capacity that's a bit of an issue there. So even if you are kind of doing all the engagement and all the investments and all the you kind of still run into what are some of the, and I saw you were taking notes furiously, so I'm sure you have reflections on what has been said so far, but also what are some of the resources that you've seen that actually work for local governance. So if you can pick on that, and you feel free to reflect, because I saw you've got many points.
Thank you so much. Yes, my hand is aching from taking about a page of notes from the fantastic insights from my co-panelists. And I think the key thing that I've taken from them so far is something at Chatham House we call negotiating dependencies. And I'll get into what that means slightly in the context of building strong, robust public institutions. Now, the issue of institutional capacity, both at a national level and a regional level, is something that's come up time and time again, not only in the run-up to the summit, but in some of the side events we've been involved in the summit. Chatham House a few days ago convened a dialogue on how to integrate AI into digital public infrastructure. Optionality for global majority countries to do so, with a view to, say, improving the delivery of crucial public services, or building shared prosperity, or strategic autonomy. And something that came up in that conversation, in our broader thinking about this connection between strong institutions, autonomy over tech, and dependence, was the need to take a step back, look at the entirety of the stack, as Rajesh really, really rightly pointed out, and think, where can we demand autonomy and meaningfully build it? And where are we going to have to accept dependence on foreign hyperscalers of the US or China? And so what our work has led us to in thinking about how to, I suppose, unlock autonomy in the interest of building strong, robust institutions is the need for countries, decision makers, those building the institutions to take a step back and figure out which dependencies are acceptable and where are they going to fight for autonomy. So our work has led us to building blocks which have come up again with my fantastic co-panelist insights. On the primary level, so these are core inputs into something like technological sovereignty. In the interest of building a strong institution, how much is a country willing to give up when it comes to data? How much is a country willing to give up when it comes to compute access? And so by mapping out where existing dependencies lie, where potential sacrifices can be made, and where additional investment and focus needs to be, again, concentrated, countries can develop a more robust strategy, again, in the interest of building strong institutions. I'm not going to sketch out what these different pathways mean, But instead, I'm going to focus on one, which again has come up time and time again in our work, and specifically in the context of open source as this pathway to sovereignty, open source as applied in strong public institutions in the run-up to the summit. And this pathway is something we call diversification. So resource-constrained powers who are seeking, again, to manage their dependencies, figure out what they want to invest in and what dependencies they're willing to accept, wanting to build strong institutions, again, that can mainline AI directly into public service delivery and, as you said, enable cross-border cooperation, might take a step back and figure out which foreign capabilities or foreign services they're willing to accept at some levels of the stack and where they'd like to invest in indigenous solutions. And I mentioned open source earlier because this has come up time and time again, and I'm sure it's going to be absolutely no surprise to our audience here today. An example which has really stuck with me, and Rafi, I'd be really interested in your thoughts on this, is the Southeast Asian languages under one network model, so a multilingual sea lion LLM. And this is something we've called, again, in a really interesting collaboration with AI Safety Asia, open models with local adaptation. Really balancing, again, inputs from open source models potentially provided by foreign providers with adaptation to a local context. And so I think leaving the summit, what I'm really going to be interested in is I think this connection between drawing on, I guess, inputs from the open source community, fine-tuning and locally adapting their contributions, and then perhaps doing so not only in the service of, again, strong, robust institutions at the national level who are AI ready, but also on this kind of collective cross-border level. I hope that makes sense.
It does, and I'm going to let Rafi kind of fit into that as well, because you've segued really nicely into his part. But also, if you can also touch upon, feel free to react to what Bella has said. But also, if you can also touch upon on the what you've seen as best practice in international and cross-border collaboration, maybe in healthcare, climate resilience, education, anywhere you've seen good stories to tell. Please do share.
I mean, I do think a lot about the local fine-tuning. And I think that that's actually a really powerful concept of like we can all contribute to a core and then locally fine-tune for our values and our needs. And I think that this has shown up in a bunch of different ways. And I'm interested personally in all these alternative, I don't even want to call it alternative, but like other architectures that enable this to be possible. Because in some ways, we're kind of being fed a regime that says it's not possible, but I think like architecturally it actually is in a bunch of different ways. So I love the indigenous data model, like looking at what different indigenous peoples have done around data collectives for their local areas. So there's a group of people, for example, in Hawaii that is doing this for their genomic data, because genomic data is really useful for pharmaceutical models. And so like they've been looking for ways that they can both monetize, but also have the provenance of their data as it goes to these pharmaceutical models. So there are some professors out of UCSD starting to build actually what these data trusts could look like for Hawaiian people. And I think that that model could be replicated in lots of different parts of the world. Mozilla is actually attempting to do a bunch of this. So we're creating something that we call the Mozilla Data Collaborative, or Collective, sorry. And what the collective is meant to be is it meant to be a marketplace of ethically sourced but provenance traced data sets so that you could bring your data. We'll actually help you scrub it, clean it, etc., and also make sure you have the appropriate licenses on it so that people can come find the data sets that they want to train their models, but make sure that attribution is given, compensation is given, etc. So we're literally in conversations with almost every radio station on the planet to try to get their recordings and their transcripts onto the marketplace, not for Mozilla to make money. In fact, we actually want the radio stations to have a monetization path for all this data that they're sitting on, and not simply have it scraped by big model providers to try to soak that into their systems. Instead, require that it be license require that compensation be given. So I think there are models there. And on the computational side, I think there's also a lot of interesting things showing up around federated learning opportunities. For those of you who don't know what federated learning is, think of, Google did this very famously when they trained their handwriting model across everyone's Android phones. So your handwriting is very personal and private. Your handwriting is on your device. And Google is able to train a handwriting recognition model that didn't require them to get access to your data, because part of the training happened on your phone, and then the model waits or shipped it back up for centralized training. And I think something like that actually could be an interesting model for international collaboration of, like, I can bring my data to the game, my healthcare data, my values data, my language data, but not have to release it to a different company, or sorry, a different country. Instead, allow you to do some of the training on my compute, on my infrastructure, and only ship model weights back up, and actually then create bigger models across borders and across geographies that could actually take into account different healthcare scenarios, different value systems, et cetera, in there. So I think that there are these interesting alternative architectures that we can actually start leaning into, these data trust models, these federated learning models that actually could be massive enablers for cooperation and allow us to build these foundational things that we can then fine tune and bring to our local context.
Thanks so much, Rafi. That fine-tuning seems to be definitely a thing in this conversation, how you kind of built for different cultures and countries. And Halak, maybe I can come to you next, because we keep talking about kind of international cooperation and coordination, but I'm wondering, how do you translate that, chit-chat into actual skills, capacity, capability for emerging economies? We are in a very international AI Impact Summit. Kind of how do we bring that from we talk about governance to all this international partnership actually delivering for emerging economies?
It's a good question. I think, let me start out by saying capacity building isn't just running workshops or basically talking to regulators about, this should be done. What it is capacity building, I think, for emerging economies especially, is critical because, hold on, let me think. Okay, so emerging economies have unequal access to data, information, and technology, right? So what are we trying to solve for here in terms of capacity building? The first thing I would say is shared evidence. So what we need is players to help into this capacity building system with documents, results, performance, benchmarks to lift up other players. That, I think, would be number one. The second thing I think is key and sometimes overlooked is the value of procurement policies. And I agree with Isabella. What if we had an industry coalition, like a cross-border network, where they're solving for procurement policies or procurement rules? And what this does is this brings in global players. So now what you're doing is you're opening up your country to different markets. The next thing I would say is a lot of, let me put it this way. So there are developers who develop the technology, and then there are deployers. They buy the technology and they use it. So, for example, like a public sector agency. Why is it so
whatever you think is needed to kind of get to that point where we can actually talk about governance meaningfully and as a broad, international, inclusive as possible.
I might actually start making a lot of sense, and that aligned with governance opportunities, philosophical opportunities makes me very excited. Like MIT, there's a economist, Frank Nagel, has a report recently that approximately $24 billion US dollars are being wasted by not switching to open source models right now. So the economics are starting to make a lot of sense. So I think if once all these stars align, it becomes almost obvious what an answer could look like for local governance around open source AI models, et cetera. So I'm really excited for that in the next 12 to 18 months.
Thank you. Rajesh.
No, I agree with both of what's been said so far, but I also want to give a sense of, I think it's, when you look at AI governance, and people tend to sort of lead with regulation first, I believe that countries and especially the countries which we talked about in terms of more from an inclusion point of view, you got to lead with innovation first mindset, because I think regulation is required and certainly needed, but I think innovation is probably needed more in some sense. And also when you look at the AI governance across all of that, what we do, while there could be horizontal governance which will apply to every AI systems, I think the more meaningful governance that you're going to find when you get into sectoral governance, meaning when you look at the AI systems for healthcare, and you'll find the understanding of a harm in the healthcare segment is very different from financial services and so on. So how do you get into those sectoral areas, and then you can have meaningful governance structure? And last but not the least, you need to have the right talent and people who understand all of this, both in public sector and people who are supposedly governing all of this. That is something which is, it's not the talent in terms of broader AI model building and people who are building AI systems, but how do you make sure that the talent in the governance space, in the governments, and people who are actually regulating it, they don't understand the real harm, and then it's going to be a bigger issue. And especially when it comes to the list of countries that we talked about always, when you get deeper down the list, you will find that the talent is going to be a huge issue in terms of understanding. Yeah.
Thank you. And, as someone who lives in Brussels, I'll make sure to take that message back. Halak.
Okay, so what am I most excited about, I guess, in the next 12 months? I mean, in the last few days, you've seen companies really, really excited about AI, but what you've also seen is countries very excited about AI. So what does this mean in governance? It means that the community and the participation is only going to increase. I don't see it going backwards. And so as technology is evolving, more players are going to have a voice in the system, and the standards and the ITU bodies or the ISO bodies. And I think because of this convergence, we are going to, as society, just like increase our literacy of not only AI, but technology, but also bring it into whatever we're in, if we're in the private sector, if we're in the public sector. And because of that, I think, I think a lot of progress will be made in the next 12 months, and you'll see it as it converges.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the panel. Thanks for being here, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great to see you. Thank you for coming. It was really great. Yeah, I know. Amazing panel, and thank you so much. Small something from AI Summit side. The panel was really great.